So, before we start talking about the pros and cons of globalization, we need to know what it is. In general terms, globalization is the process by which the world has become and is becoming more connected and interdependent, both culturally and economically. This is often attributed to increased trade and cultural exchange. A shrinking world. People often use this term to describe the world as it undergoes the complex processes of globalization. This doesn't mean that the world is physically becoming smaller. The globalization has led to easier access of information through technology such as computers and phones, and fast methods of transporting both goods and people, such as planes and trains. So, when people refer to a shrinking world, what they mean is the world seems like it's becoming smaller due to the ease at which we're now able to access information, resources, goods, and services. One of the main effects of globalization has been increased trade and the ability for companies to operate across borders. This has meant that national firms are no longer the biggest firms, but multinational corporations, that's corporations who operate in multiple countries, are. These are sometimes known as transnational corporations. There are pros and cons of this. On the one hand, multinational companies are able to provide goods and services to different countries. This is because multinational corporations often have their headquarters situated in developed countries, or MEDCs, which is more economically developed countries, such as the USA, with smaller offices and factories where goods are being produced, tending to be in developing countries, or LEDCs, less economically developed countries, where labor is cheaper and production costs are lower. Of course, for the companies and their consumers, this means cheaper products. However, many people question the effects on developing countries. Multinational corporations are able to pay workers very little for labor. That's why they move to these countries in the first place. And often among these laborers includes young children. That's why critics argue that this is an exploitative form of work and that these working conditions are bad for workers. They say that this is a massive downside of the rise of multinational corporations. However, others argue that this could be a positive thing, as it allows developing countries to slowly develop their own industries, becoming less reliant on multinational corporations and eventually becoming self-reliant. They also say that the people in these countries who are working for multinational corporations might otherwise have no jobs or income at all, and that the factories being in these countries actually produces jobs for the people who live there. So globalized trade. Trade, of course, has existed for a very long time. No country has ever had everything it could ever need or want. As a result of this, countries have to trade, which means that they buy from and sell things to each other. Countries can set trade tariffs, which is a tax on imports or exports. The main reason that they usually do this is to protect their own domestic industry by taxing foreign products to make them more expensive. A good thing about this, of course, is that domestic industries are protected because this deters people from buying from multinational corporations and other foreign companies because they're more expensive due to the tax. On the other hand, a lot of people argue that creating barriers to trade such as tariffs has a negative effect on economic growth and that it makes goods more expensive for consumers in that country. So, countries can go in two different directions, or of course they can go in a mixture of the two, which most countries choose to do, in terms of dealing with globalized trade. They can try to protect domestic industry with trade tariffs and other restrictions, which is often called protectionism, or they could open up the country to global trade, which would be called liberalization of trade. As we've covered, there are pros and cons to both of these. So another impact of globalization is increased migration. Migration is the movement of people between countries or within a country, so this can be permanent or temporary. In the context of globalization, there has been increased international migration. Some people have argued that migration causes too much competition for jobs. However, others point out that oftentimes when migrants move to a country to work, they actually fill skills gaps, which means that they'll be working in industries that the destination country actually needs workers to fill. So, a recent example is, in the UK, there was a very obvious gap in the fruit picking industry due to the halting of workers coming to the UK during the coronavirus pandemic. In addition, another good thing could be, as migrants move overseas to find better paid jobs or better working conditions, migrants who move for work sometimes send money back to their families in their country of origin, which actually benefits the country of origin. They can also bring knowledge back to their country if they choose to return. So they could bring back skills learned through working in a foreign country in a foreign industry, or they could bring knowledge back from studying at a foreign institution. However, a common problem that is often pointed out is the concept of brain drain. So, this is where the most skilled or the youngest workers move to work and study abroad. What this does is causes a drain on the quality of the workforce or the quality of education in those workers' home countries. As with all issues, there are pros and cons to migration, but certainly globalization has made it easier to migrate. There are both pros and cons to globalization. But one thing that's true is that it definitely has been happening and it definitely is happening. So that means it's really important to talk about. But the debate around globalization is still ongoing,